Historical records indicate that the inner courts of Imperial China functioned as highly regulated political environments where proximity to imperial women carried both opportunity and profound risk. Palace servants, including eunuchs, maids, attendants, and administrative aides, operated within systems designed not merely for service, but for surveillance, loyalty enforcement, and political containment. Nowhere were these pressures more evident than in cases involving alleged betrayal of empresses, whose authority within the inner palace depended heavily on controlled information, ritual hierarchy, and carefully managed alliances. Surviving court regulations from multiple dynasties suggest that palace service was embedded within a framework of collective accountability. Servants attached to an empress were expected to maintain absolute discretion regarding internal disputes, health conditions, private correspondence, and succession politics. The empress's quarters were not simply domestic spaces, but administrative centers where patronage networks were cultivated and influence over imperial heirs was negotiated. As a result, any perceived breach of loyalty by attendants was interpreted not only as personal betrayal, but as a potential destabilization of imperial governance. Legal codes of the Tang and Song periods reveal that palace servants occupied an ambiguous legal category. While technically state dependents, they were also treated as extensions of the households they served. This dual status allowed authorities to apply both formal judicial procedures and extrajudicial disciplinary measures. Contemporary accounts describe investigative processes that blended interrogation, witness testimony from other servants, and the use of internal memorial reports submitted by palace supervisors. The absence of transparent legal representation meant that accusations often unfolded within closed bureaucratic circuits, leaving the accused vulnerable to the political needs of higher-ranking figures. Chroniclers noted that one of the most feared accusations involved the unauthorized transmission of information beyond palace walls. Such acts could include revealing the empress's political preferences, reporting conflicts among consorts, or conveying rumors regarding imperial succession. Because the imperial court depended heavily on secrecy to preserve stability, these actions were frequently categorized under treason-adjacent offenses, even when the information transmitted was ambiguous or unverifiable. Surviving disciplinary records suggest that punishment severity was determined less by the factual accuracy of the betrayal and more by the perceived consequences for factional balance within the court. Mechanisms of investigation often began with internal confinement. Servants suspected of betrayal could be isolated within restricted quarters, while supervisors gathered statements from colleagues. Contemporary palace manuals describe interrogation rooms maintained within service compounds, indicating that investigative detention was an institutionalized practice rather than an improvised response. The process emphasized confession as a primary form of verification, reflecting broader judicial traditions in Imperial China where admission of guilt was considered essential for case closure. Physical punishment, while not uniformly applied, remained a documented component of disciplinary enforcement. Legal codes of the Ming dynasty detail corporal penalties ranging from beating with light bamboo rods to more severe flogging with heavy bamboo, depending on the classification of the offense. When applied to palace servants accused of betraying empresses, these punishments were often framed as corrective measures intended to restore moral order rather than purely retributive actions. However, contemporary accounts suggest that the distinction between correction and coercion was frequently blurred, particularly when interrogators sought rapid confessions. Eunuchs occupied a particularly complex position within this system. Surviving documents indicate that their closeness to imperial women granted them access to sensitive information while simultaneously exposing them to suspicion from scholar officials who viewed eunuch influence as politically dangerous. Accusations of betrayal involving eunuchs could therefore intersect with broader factional struggles between court bureaucrats and inner palace administrators. Punishments imposed on eunuchs were sometimes used symbolically to reaffirm imperial control over palace networks, demonstrating that proximity to power did not exempt individuals from discipline. Female attendants, including senior maids and chamber supervisors, faced different but equally significant risks. Historical records suggest that they were often held collectively responsible for breaches occurring within their assigned quarters. This collective liability system meant that a single accusation could trigger investigations affecting multiple servants, reinforcing mutual surveillance and discouraging informal alliances. Chroniclers observed that such practices fostered environments of cautious silence, where even routine interactions were shaped by awareness of potential suspicion. Exile represents another documented form of punishment applied to palace servants accused of betrayal. While less immediately visible than corporal discipline, removal from the palace carried substantial social consequences. Servants expelled from imperial service often faced restricted marriage prospects, limited employment opportunities, and lingering association with disloyalty. In some cases, exile involved reassignment to distant imperial workshops or labor units, reflecting the state's preference for controlled redistribution rather than outright release into civilian society. More severe cases, particularly those interpreted as contributing to factional conflict or succession instability, could result in penal servitude or death sentences. Legal commentaries from the Qing dynasty indicate that execution of palace servants was rare but not unprecedented, especially when accusations involved collusion with external officials or interference in imperial lineage matters. Surviving judicial memorials suggest that such sentences required imperial authorization, highlighting the symbolic gravity attached to disciplining individuals connected to the empress's household. The role of the empress herself in these processes varied depending on political context. Historical records indicate that some empresses actively intervened in disciplinary proceedings, either advocating leniency for trusted attendants or supporting harsh punishment to demonstrate authority. In other cases, decisions were mediated by the emperor or by senior palace administrators seeking to prevent conflicts among consorts from escalating into broader political crises. This variability reflects the dynamic nature of inner court power, where punishment systems functioned not only as instruments of control but also as tools of negotiation. Surviving correspondence and administrative notes suggest that accusations of betrayal were sometimes strategically deployed. Rival consorts, ambitious eunuchs, or external officials could exploit the secrecy of palace life to frame servants as informants or conspirators. Because investigative processes relied heavily on testimony from individuals operating within the same constrained environment, distinguishing genuine betrayal from politically motivated accusation proved difficult. Chroniclers frequently remarked on the atmosphere of cautious calculation that emerged from this uncertainty, where servants balanced loyalty with self-preservation. The psychological impact of these disciplinary systems is indirectly visible through memorial petitions and anecdotal accounts preserved in unofficial histories. Servants described environments characterized by vigilance, restrained speech, and careful adherence to ritual conduct. The possibility that ordinary actions might be interpreted as disloyal created forms of behavioral regulation extending beyond formal punishment. In this sense, the punishment system operated as both a reactive mechanism addressing specific accusations and a preventative structure shaping daily life within the palace. Long-term effects of these practices extended into the broader administrative culture of imperial governance. The emphasis on secrecy, confession-based investigation, and hierarchical accountability mirrored disciplinary approaches applied in provincial bureaucracies and military institutions. Scholars have suggested that the palace functioned as a concentrated model of imperial authority, where mechanisms of surveillance and punishment were intensified due to the proximity of succession politics and personal relationships. At the same time, historical evidence indicates that the system was neither uniformly harsh nor entirely inflexible. Instances of pardon, commutation, and quiet reassignment appear in surviving records, suggesting that authorities sometimes prioritized stability over punitive demonstration. Such decisions often occurred when investigations risked exposing deeper factional tensions, or when the accused possessed knowledge considered too sensitive to be publicly examined. The punishment of palace servants accused of betraying empresses, therefore, cannot be understood solely through the lens of legal enforcement. Surviving documents suggest that these measures operated within a broader framework of political signaling, household management, and information control. Discipline served to reaffirm the sanctity of the empress's quarters, reinforce hierarchical boundaries, and deter the circulation of destabilizing knowledge. Contemporary accounts describe the inner palace as a space where loyalty was continuously evaluated, yet rarely fully verifiable. Within this environment, punishment functioned as a visible reminder of imperial expectations, while the investigative processes surrounding accusations reflected deeper anxieties regarding secrecy, influence, and succession. The experiences of palace servants reveal how governance in Imperial China extended beyond formal institutions into intimate domestic spheres, where control over information became inseparable from the maintenance of political order. The surviving record, fragmented yet consistent in its themes, suggests that accusations of betrayal carried consequences shaped as much by political context as by individual actions. Through confinement, corporal discipline, exile, and in rare instances execution, the imperial court maintained a system designed to preserve silence, regulate loyalty, and protect the authority of empresses whose influence depended on carefully guarded boundaries within the palace world. Surviving documents from later imperial periods suggest that the punishment of palace servants accused of betraying empresses became increasingly intertwined with bureaucratic formalization, even as secrecy remained a defining characteristic of inner court governance. During the Ming and Qing dynasties in particular, administrative memorials indicate that palace discipline evolved into a layered process involving eunuch supervisors, internal security offices, and in severe cases, external judicial review conducted under carefully restricted conditions. This gradual institutionalization did not eliminate arbitrariness, but instead created structured pathways through which suspicion could be translated into official action. Historical records indicate that internal palace security units were tasked with monitoring communication flows between servants and the outside world. These units often operated through routine inspection of written materials, supervision of supply deliveries, and observation of interpersonal relationships among attendants. Contemporary accounts describe how even minor irregularities, such as unexplained possession of written notes or unsanctioned conversations with visiting officials, could initiate inquiries. The emphasis on information containment reflected the political importance of the empress's quarters as spaces where imperial health, succession prospects, and factional alignments were quietly negotiated. When suspicions escalated, interrogation procedures typically sought to reconstruct networks of interaction rather than isolate individual misconduct. Surviving judicial commentaries suggest that investigators frequently examined patterns of association, attempting to determine whether an accused servant had acted independently or as part of a broader exchange of information. This approach aligned with imperial legal traditions that prioritized the exposure of collective conspiracy over the punishment of isolated transgressions. Consequently, a single accusation could expand into a wide-ranging inquiry affecting multiple members of an empress's household. Chroniclers noted that confession remained central to disciplinary resolution, yet the process through which admissions were obtained was influenced by both legal precedent and palace politics. Bamboo beating and prolonged questioning were documented methods used to compel statements, but the application of such measures often depended on the perceived gravity of the potential betrayal. In cases involving sensitive political implications, authorities sometimes delayed physical coercion, relying instead on psychological pressure created through isolation, uncertainty, and the threat of collective punishment. Surviving accounts suggest that this environment frequently led servants to confess preemptively, whether or not evidence of wrongdoing was conclusive. The concept of collective responsibility continued to shape punitive outcomes. Palace regulations from the Qing period indicate that supervisors could be disciplined for failing to detect disloyalty among subordinates, reinforcing hierarchical accountability within the empress's household. This principle encouraged senior attendants to engage in continuous oversight of their colleagues, effectively extending the surveillance apparatus beyond formal investigators. Contemporary observers remarked that such arrangements produced a climate in which loyalty was measured not only through obedience, but through active demonstration of vigilance. Political context played a decisive role in determining punishment severity. Historical records suggest that periods marked by succession uncertainty or heightened rivalry among consorts often corresponded with more aggressive disciplinary enforcement. In these moments, accusations of betrayal could be interpreted as manifestations of broader factional threats, prompting authorities to impose exemplary punishment intended to deter further instability. Conversely, during politically stable periods, similar accusations might result in quieter resolutions, including reassignment or supervised confinement without public acknowledgement. The Empress Dowager's influence introduced additional complexity into these processes. Surviving memorials indicate that Empress Dowagers, particularly those exercising regency authority, could intervene directly in disciplinary decisions affecting palace servants. Their involvement sometimes reflected efforts to protect trusted attendants whose loyalty was considered indispensable, but it could also serve to remove individuals perceived as aligned with rival factions. Chroniclers observed that punishment decisions in such circumstances were often less about adjudicating factual guilt than about recalibrating influence within the palace hierarchy. Gender dynamics further shaped the application of punishment. Female attendants, despite their limited formal authority, were frequently positioned as intermediaries in the exchange of information among consorts, imperial children, and administrative staff. Legal commentaries suggest that this intermediary role increased their vulnerability to accusations of betrayal, particularly when political tensions heightened suspicion toward informal communication channels. Punishments imposed on female servants often emphasized moral correction, reflecting Confucian ideals concerning propriety and obedience, yet the practical consequences of disciplinary action could be equally severe as those experienced by eunuchs. Eunuchs, meanwhile, remained subject to a distinct combination of suspicion and necessity. Historical records indicate that their administrative expertise and proximity to imperial women made them indispensable, while their perceived detachment from conventional family structures contributed to anxieties regarding personal ambition and factional manipulation. Accusations of betrayal involving eunuchs were sometimes leveraged by scholar officials advocating restrictions on eunuch authority, demonstrating how disciplinary proceedings could intersect with ideological debates over proper governance. Punishments in these cases occasionally carried symbolic significance, reinforcing narratives about the dangers of excessive eunuch influence. Exile and reassignment continued to function as important disciplinary tools, particularly when authorities sought to neutralize potential threats without provoking further political tension. Surviving administrative registers document the transfer of accused servants to imperial tomb maintenance units, textile workshops, or remote palace estates. Such measures removed individuals from sensitive environments while preserving the state's control over their labor and movement. Contemporary accounts suggest that reassignment often served as a compromise between punitive demonstration and the preservation of institutional knowledge possessed by experienced servants. In more serious cases, especially those involving alleged collaboration with external officials or manipulation of imperial communications, formal judicial proceedings could be initiated outside the palace. Legal records from the Qing dynasty indicate that these cases were handled with exceptional caution, as public trials risked exposing internal palace dynamics that authorities preferred to keep concealed. Investigations conducted beyond palace walls were therefore frequently characterized by restricted documentation, controlled testimony, and carefully managed sentencing announcements. The psychological dimension of punishment remained a consistent theme throughout these developments. Memorial petitions and unofficial histories reveal that the fear of accusation shaped servant behavior in ways that extended beyond compliance with explicit regulations. Servants reportedly cultivated deliberate emotional restraint, avoided forming visible alliances, and adhered closely to ritualized patterns of speech and conduct. This behavioral discipline functioned as an informal extension of the punishment system, reducing opportunities for suspicion while reinforcing hierarchical norms within the Empress's household. Long-term consequences for punished servants often extended beyond their immediate removal from palace life. Historical records indicate that association with betrayal could affect family members, particularly in cases where servants maintained limited contact with relatives outside the palace. While collective familial punishment was less common for palace servants than for officials convicted of treason, social stigma and reduced opportunities for reintegration into civilian society remained significant outcomes. Chroniclers observed that such consequences contributed to the deterrent effect of disciplinary practices, reinforcing the perception that palace service demanded unwavering discretion. At the institutional level, the punishment system contributed to the consolidation of information control as a central feature of imperial governance. Scholars examining palace administration have noted parallels between inter-court disciplinary mechanisms and broader bureaucratic practices, emphasizing memorial reporting, hierarchical oversight, and confession-based adjudication. The palace environment intensified these practices due to the intimate proximity between personal relationships and state power, creating conditions in which the management of loyalty became inseparable from the maintenance of political stability. Despite the severity associated with accusations of betrayal, Surviving evidence also points to moments of ambiguity and negotiation within the punishment process. Some records describe instances in which investigations concluded without formal sentencing, either due to insufficient evidence or intervention by influential patrons. In other cases, confessions were accepted but punishment was mitigated through appeals emphasizing prior service, illness, or perceived manipulation by more powerful figures. These examples suggest that the system, while structured to enforce discipline, retained elements of flexibility shaped by interpersonal relationships and shifting political priorities. Contemporary accounts ultimately portray the punishment of palace servants accused of betraying empresses as a mechanism operating at the intersection of legal authority, domestic hierarchy, and political strategy. The procedures governing investigation, confession, and sentencing reflected broader imperial concerns regarding secrecy and stability, while the lived experiences of servants reveal the human dimensions of governance within enclosed court environments. Through surveillance, interrogation, reassignment, and symbolic punishment, the imperial palace maintained a system designed not only to address acts of disloyalty, but to preempt them, embedding caution and controlled silence into the daily rhythms of those who lived and worked in the shadow of imperial authority. Surviving documentation from the late imperial period suggests that the enduring function of punishment against palace servants accused of betraying empresses was not solely deterrence, but the preservation of a carefully balanced informational hierarchy. The inner court operated as a space where political decisions were often shaped through informal influence, ritual proximity, and the management of imperial heirs. Within this environment, servants represented both conduits of knowledge and potential vulnerabilities. Punishment systems therefore evolved to reinforce boundaries between observation and disclosure, ensuring that those who witnessed the private dimensions of imperial life remained structurally constrained from transforming that knowledge into political leverage. Historical records indicate that the architecture of palace life itself contributed to the enforcement of these disciplinary practices. Restricted corridors, segmented living quarters, and controlled access points limited unsupervised interaction among servants from different households. Contemporary palace manuals describe schedules that regulated movement, meal distribution, and service rotations, reducing opportunities for unsanctioned communication. These spatial and temporal controls functioned as preventative measures, yet they also intensified the consequences when accusations of betrayal emerged, as deviations from regulated behavior were more easily interpreted as deliberate acts rather than incidental occurrences. Chroniclers noted that the management of rumor represented a persistent challenge within the palace. The empress's household, often composed of individuals drawn from diverse regional backgrounds and varying levels of literacy, became an environment where informal narratives circulated despite official prohibitions. Authorities regarded rumor not merely as social disruption, but as a potential catalyst for factional conflict, particularly when it concerned succession prospects or the emperor's favor toward particular consorts. Punishment of servants accused of transmitting such information reflected broader efforts to control narrative formation within the court, reinforcing the expectation that silence constituted a form of loyalty. Legal commentaries from the Qing dynasty reveal that written communication was treated with particular scrutiny. Palace servants were generally prohibited from maintaining personal correspondence without supervision, and materials entering or leaving the inner court were subject to inspection by designated eunuch officials. When accusations of betrayal involved written messages, investigations often extended to handwriting analysis, verification of delivery routes, and interrogation of intermediaries. Surviving memorials suggest that these cases were considered especially serious because written evidence could facilitate the persistence and spread of sensitive information beyond the immediate control of palace authorities. The emotional restraint expected of servants emerges as a recurring theme in anecdotal sources. While direct personal testimonies are rare, unofficial histories and literary references indicate that palace attendants cultivated behaviors emphasizing neutrality, measured speech, and avoidance of visible attachment to factional interests.